Stay away from
Stay
him,
away
her
from
friend
him.
whispered urgently. But it was too late. He was already walking toward her. And somehow, he already knew her name. Welcome to Midnight Soul Love. Where love, power, and obsession collide. Subscribe, because some stories stay with you forever. She had not planned to be here tonight. That was the first thing Ito-han told herself as she stood near the tall glass windows of the Velvet Axis, watching the city lights flicker 40 floors below like scattered embers. She had only come because Jade had insisted, because Jade always insisted, and because saying no to Jade Mensa required an energy Ito-han did not always have after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. She was still a resident. Still learning how to separate the weight of other people's pain from the quiet she needed to carry herself home each night. She had not planned to be here, surrounded by men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent and women who moved through the room like they had been born knowing how to be watched. She had not planned to order her second drink. She had not planned to stay past midnight. She had certainly not planned for him. The room did not change when he walked in. Not exactly. The music did not stop, the laughter did not die, the bartender did not drop a glass. But something shifted, a frequency, a pressure in the air the way a storm shifts things before the rain comes. Ito-han felt it before she saw him. A quiet that moved through the crowd like a current, not silence, but the particular hush of people becoming suddenly, carefully aware. Conversations did not end. They just lowered. Glasses were lifted more slowly. Eyes moved with more intention. No one spoke when he entered. They waited. He was tall. She registered that first, then the way he moved, not hurried, not performing ease, but genuinely unhurried in a way that had nothing to prove. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat. His face was sharp and still, the kind of stillness that is not emptiness but rather the deliberate withholding of expression. Korean, she guessed, mid-30s, with the kind of authority that had clearly stopped being new to him years ago. He moved through the room the way water moves through stone, not around things, but through them, and the room simply made space. He did not look around for anyone. He did not need to. Two men flanked him at a careful distance, not bodyguards in any obvious sense. They wore no earpieces, carried no visible threat, but their eyes moved differently from everyone else's eyes in the room. They watched the exits. They watched the hands of strangers. Ito-han noticed this because she was trained to notice things, to read a room for danger the way she read a chart for symptoms. Something is wrong with this picture. Not wrong. Just, layered. His name is Seo Junho, Jade said, appearing at Ito-han's elbow with a fresh drink she hadn't asked for. Jade's voice was low, her eyes not on Ito-han but on the man across the room. And you should not be looking at him the way you're looking at him. I'm not looking at him any particular way, Ito-han said. You're doing the thing where you go very still. You only do that when something has your full attention. Ito-han took the drink. Tell me about him. Jade hesitated. Just a half second, but Ito-han caught it. Jade Mensa did not hesitate. She moved through the world with the cheerful confidence of someone who had never once second-guessed a dinner reservation or a first impression. A hesitation from Jade was worth more than a full speech from anyone else. He owns half the buildings in this part of the city, Jade said finally. The other half, people say, he simply influences. Real estate, imports, some kind of private investment fund with a name nobody can fully trace. He is very, very wealthy. She paused. And very, very complicated. Complicated how? Jade turned to look at her then. Direct. Steady. People disappear from his orbit, Ito-han. Not bodies in the river disappear. But women who get close to him. They just, stop being who they were before. One of my colleagues dated a man who worked for him for 3 months. 3 months. She left her job, relocated to another city, and won't tell anyone exactly why. She leaned closer. No woman leaves unchanged. That's what people say. Itohan opened her mouth to say something light, something dismissive, something that would restore the comfortable distance she preferred to keep between herself and stories like this. Then she felt it. The specific, unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned, slowly, because turning quickly would admit too much, and found him already looking at her. Not glancing. Not sweeping the room and pausing. Looking. Directly. Deliberately. The way a person looks when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. She held the eye contact for exactly 2 seconds longer than was comfortable, then looked away. Her heart was doing something she didn't appreciate. She did not see him move toward her. That was the thing that unnerved her most, later, when she replayed it. She had looked away, and then he was simply there, close enough that she could smell something clean and expensive, close enough that the crowd had shifted without ceremony to make room for his proximity. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, accented, precise. She turned. Met his eyes. "Excuse me. This section of the lounge. It's reserved." She looked around. There were no signs. No velvet ropes. No indication of any kind that she had crossed some invisible threshold. "There's no marking." "No," he agreed. He did not move. He did not apologize. He simply looked at her with those dark, still eyes and waited, for what, she couldn't tell. "Then maybe," she said, keeping her voice even, "you should stop watching me long enough to put up a sign." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, restrained almost immediately, as if he'd caught himself. He said nothing for a moment. Just looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, not displeasure, not interest exactly, more like a kind of recalibration. Like she had said something he had not anticipated, and he was deciding what to do with that. "You're a doctor," he said then. The word dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. She kept her face neutral by a significant effort of will. "I've never met you before." "No," he said simply. And then, before she could ask the question forming rapidly in her mind, he turned and walked back into the room, and the crowd closed behind him like water. Jade materialized at her side within 30 seconds. "What did he say to you?" Itohan looked at the space where he had been standing. "He knew I was a doctor." Jade stared at her. "Itohan. I know. I told you to stay away from him. I know." She set her drink down carefully on the nearest surface. "Why does he know me? If this story already has its hands around your heart. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what happens next will change everything. And we mean everything." That question lived in her for the next week like a splinter she couldn't locate. She went to work. She reviewed charts, attended rounds, explained diagnoses to frightened families in the particular careful language she had practiced until it felt like breathing. She did not think about him. She thought about him constantly. She told herself it was simply the puzzle of it. A woman who has spent years training her mind to solve things does not easily release an unsolved thing, and not anything more complicated than intellectual irritation. He appeared on Tuesday. Not at the hospital. She was leaving a bookshop 2 blocks from her apartment building, a paper bag in her arms, her coat still open because she'd been warm from the reading section and hadn't stopped to button it. She stepped onto the pavement and nearly walked into him, or rather, he was simply there, standing just outside the door, as if he had known she would emerge at precisely that moment. "That's not a coincidence," she said immediately. "No," he said. He had the same quality in daylight that he'd had at the Velvet Axis. The stillness. The sense of attention entirely focused. He glanced at the bag in her arms. "Anything good? Why are you here?" He looked at her for a moment. "There's a coffee shop 2 doors down. I come on Tuesdays." She looked at the coffee shop. Then at him. Then back at the coffee shop. Every Tuesday. For the past 8 months. She did not know what to do with that. He seemed to understand this, because he simply nodded once, as if something had been agreed upon that she hadn't fully processed, and walked in the direction of the coffee shop without looking back to see if she followed. She did not follow. She walked home. She spent the rest of the evening trying to remember if she had ever seen him there before, the tall man, the still eyes, the coffee shop 2 doors down, and found that she genuinely could not say whether she had simply missed him or whether he had simply been watching her long enough that his presence had begun to register as ambient, as background, as part of the landscape she moved through without truly seeing. She did not sleep well. On Thursday, she worked a late shift. She left the hospital at 11:15, exhausted in the specific draining way that only comes from a shift where you lose someone, not through fault, not through failure, just through the ordinary terrible arbitrariness of the body's limits. She stood outside the staff entrance for a moment breathing the cold night air, her bag over one shoulder, her keys not yet in her hand, and she became aware of a disturbance further down the alley, not loud, not dramatic, but present. 2 men. A third on the ground. Voices low and controlled. She moved toward it before the caution fully formed, instinct, training, the deep inability to walk away from someone who might be hurt, and then stopped. It was him. He was crouched slightly, not on the ground but speaking to one of the other 2 men at an angle that communicated perfect authority without volume. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The man he was addressing had gone very pale and very still. The third man, she understood now, was not hurt, he was being held, quietly but completely, by the second of the 2 men she'd noticed at the velvet axis. The whole scene lasted perhaps 45 more seconds. Then the pale man nodded rapidly. The held man was released. Both of them walked quickly away, and she was left watching Seo Junho straighten and smooth the front of his jacket with the unhurried calm of a man who has tidied something minor. Then he saw her. She expected something, guilt, sharpness, a demand to know how long she'd been watching. Instead he just looked at her the way he always looked at her, that complete, unrushed attention, and said, "You should go home." What was that? A business matter. That man is fine. A pause. He will be fine. She stood there. Her keys were cold in her palm, she'd taken them out without noticing. "You're not going to explain." "Not tonight." He looked at her for a moment longer. "You had a bad shift." It wasn't a question. She stared at him. "How?" "You carry it in your face," he said simply. "When something can't be fixed." And then, quietly, before she could find words, "I'm sorry." She did not know what to do with that either. He walked past her then, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she had been someone else, someone braver or more reckless, and did not look back. She stood in the alley for another long moment, heart unsteady, something pulling at her that she didn't have a clean name for. Fear, yes. Attraction, yes. But something below both of those, more uncomfortable, more persistent. Curiosity about who he actually was. She went home. She thought about calling Jade. She didn't call Jade. She made tea she didn't drink and sat at her kitchen table going over the pieces, the lounge, the coffee shop, the alley, turning them the way you turn something strange and small in your fingers, looking for an edge that explains the whole shape. She told herself she was not involved. She told herself he had not been protecting her in any of those moments. It was coincidence, proximity, the particular kind of magnetism that very confident men project onto everyone around them without meaning anything specific by it. She told herself this on Friday. On Saturday. On Sunday morning when she woke up and found, with a start, that she had dreamed of that alley, of the particular way he had said sorry, not as an apology exactly, but as a gift, quiet and complete, offered without expectation of anything in return. She called Jade. "I think he's been watching me for a while," she said, without greeting. A long silence. How long? I don't know. She paused. Jade. What exactly do people say about him? All of it. Another silence, longer. Then, his father ran the company before him. When his father died, 3 years ago, there were questions about how. Nothing was proven. Nothing was even formally alleged. But the questions were there. A breath. He handles problems, Ito-han. Business problems, legal problems, problems that other wealthy people in this city don't want to handle publicly. He handles them quietly. That's his reputation. That is the entire substance of his reputation. Has he ever hurt anyone? Define hurt. A pause. No one who's come forward. No accusations, no lawsuits, nothing on record. But the record is not the whole picture. You know that. Ito-han sat with that. He knew I was a doctor. Then he looked into you. Which means he wanted to. Which means you should. I know. Ito-han. I mean it. Walk the other way. She said she would. She said it with the conviction of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep it. She spent 2 weeks keeping it. She did not go back to the Velvet Axis. She took a different route home on Tuesdays, past a pharmacy and a dry cleaner instead of the bookshop. She kept her head down, her hours long, her world small and manageable and contained. She threw herself into the work with the fervor of someone trying to fill a space that has recently become noticeable. She did not see him. The not seeing felt like something. She hated that it felt like something. She hated that the absence of a man she barely knew and had no business thinking about registered as an absence at all rather than simple relief. Every Tuesday she took the long way home and told herself it was practical. Every night she was not at the Velvet Axis she told herself she was safe. But safe from what, exactly, was a question she was no longer entirely sure how to answer, because the danger she had imagined at the start, that clean simple fear of a powerful unknown man, had somewhere along the way quietly become something else. Something that sat in her chest at odd moments and pressed. She told herself she was over it. She told herself she was fine. She told herself that whatever pull she had felt was simply the particular gravitational effect of a very powerful, very unusual person on someone who had never quite encountered that combination before, and that it would fade, had faded, was already gone. She was wrong, of course. She just didn't know it yet in the way you never know the things that are already waiting for you around the corner of an ordinary night. She was leaving the hospital on a Wednesday night 3 weeks later when her phone died. It was such a small thing. The battery had been low all day and she'd meant to charge it at the nurse's station and forgotten, and now the screen was dark and she was standing outside the building at 10:20 with no way to call a cab and the nearest underground station a 15-minute walk through streets that were not unsafe but were not, at that hour, entirely comfortable. She considered going back in. She stood for a moment weighing the inconvenience of it, the cold of the pavement coming up through her thin-soled shoes, the particular exhaustion that comes not from one bad thing but from a long day of small difficult things stacked too high. She decided to walk. She was fine for the first 7 minutes. Then she wasn't. She became aware of footsteps. Not her own. Measured, deliberate, not trying to catch up but maintaining exactly her pace, exactly her distance, the way someone walks when they are following and have enough experience at it to know that the skill is not in the speed but in the consistency. She turned a corner. The footsteps turned with her. She slowed. They slowed. She walked faster. They matched her. Her breathing had changed without her permission, shorter, quieter, the body making itself smaller and more careful the way it does when it recognizes something the mind has not yet caught up to. She was calculating. Running through the streets in her memory, which buildings were still open, which corners had light, where she might find another body moving through the city who was not this specific body behind her. There was a pharmacy 2 streets over that stayed open until 11. She could walk faster. She could cross the road suddenly. She could. A car slowed beside her. Black. Large. Expensive. Windows she could not see through. It rolled to a stop at the curb without drama, without urgency, and the back door opened from inside before anyone got out. She froze. For one suspended second everything was very still, the dark rectangle of the open door, the city sound suddenly distant and irrelevant, the footsteps behind her having stopped without her noticing when, and then she was grabbed. From behind. From the person she had been tracking by sound alone and had, without realizing it, stopped tracking the moment the car appeared. A hard grip at her upper arm and her bag strap simultaneously, pulling her sideways toward the open door, and she did the only thing her body knew to do, she fought. She threw her weight in the opposite direction and screamed, not a word, just sound, loud and uncontained, and kicked backward, connecting with something solid, and the grip on her arm did not loosen but shifted, and she was being bundled toward the door despite herself, her feet dragging, her free hand reaching for anything. The door closed. She was in the back of the car in the dark. Her breathing was ragged. Her bag was gone, dropped somewhere on the pavement outside. The car was moving, she could feel it, smooth and too fast, the city sliding past outside windows she couldn't see through from inside either. She pressed herself against the door and tried to find the handle and found nothing, no mechanism, no release, just smooth interior panel under her fingers where the handle should have been. She could make out shapes. The driver, separated from her by a partition she hadn't noticed. Someone beside her, not the person who had grabbed her, she understood this without being able to say exactly how, something about the weight and the stillness and the quality of the silence coming from that direction. Not aggression. Not urgency. Something else. And then a voice came from that side of the car. Low. Calm. Unhurried. Speaking not to her but to someone she still could not fully see in the darkness, the one who had grabbed her, she thought, or perhaps someone in the front, and the words came in Korean accented English, quiet and completely certain, the tone of a man saying something that is not a question and has never been a question. I told you, the voice said. A pause. 1 beat. 2. She belongs to him. The car did not slow. The city moved past outside like it always had, indifferent and lit, and Itohan sat in the dark with her heart slamming against her ribs and that sentence wrapped around her like something she could not shake loose. She belongs to him. And the worst part, the part she would not admit to herself until much later, until everything had unraveled and been rebuilt and broken again, was that even now, even here, even in this car moving through the dark towards something she could not name, a part of her already knew which him they meant. Do you think he set her up, or is he about to save her? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story kept you up, if it pulled at something in you, subscribe to Midnight Soul Love. Part 2 is coming. And you will not want to miss it. She didn't know where she was. She knew her wrists were bound. She knew the floor beneath her was cold, concrete, she thought, or something close to it, and that the air tasted of dust and old metal and something faintly chemical she couldn't name. She knew her heart was going too fast and her breathing was too shallow and that she needed, more than anything, to slow both down. She knew his voice was still in the car with her even though she was no longer in the car. She belongs to him. She forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth. Again. Her residency had trained her for crisis, not this kind of crisis, but the physiology was the same, adrenaline flooding her system, cortisol rising, the body preparing to fight or flee when neither option was currently available. So she breathed. She assessed. Her wrists were bound in front of her, not behind, zip tie, not rope, pulled tight but not cutting. Her ankles were free. She was sitting against a wall, knees drawn up, and when she opened her eyes fully the room resolved slowly out of the dark, a warehouse space, large, mostly empty, lit by a single industrial fixture hanging from a beam high above. Crates along one wall. A metal door she could not reach from where she was sitting without being noticed. Two men near the door, their backs to her, speaking in low voices she couldn't resolve into language. She did not recognize them. She did not recognize this place. She understood, with the calm clarity that sometimes comes when fear reaches a certain height and tips over into pure focus, that she had been taken deliberately. Not randomly. Not opportunistically. The car had been waiting. The person who had grabbed her had been waiting. This had been planned, and plans require reasons, and reasons require a connection, between her and whoever had decided she was worth taking. She had a very short list of connections that could explain a room like this. The list had exactly one name on it. Seo Joon-ho. She closed her eyes and let herself sit with that for exactly 10 seconds, the anger of it, the fear of it, the particular sharp humiliation of having told herself she was safe and being wrong, and then she opened them again and began, methodically, to think about how to get out. She was still thinking when the door opened. The man who entered was not one of the two she'd been watching. He was older, smaller, with a compact precision to the way he moved that reminded her, involuntarily, of the men she'd noticed flanking Joon-ho at the Velvet Axis. Not the same men. The same type. A type she was beginning to understand meant something specific about the world she had accidentally walked into. He crouched in front of her without preamble and studied her face for a moment with the detached assessment of someone evaluating an object rather than a person. "You are not hurt," he said. It was not a question. "Not yet," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Something in his expression shifted, not respect, not exactly, but a small recalibration, the same kind she had seen cross Joon-ho's face the night she hadn't backed down at the Velvet Axis. She filed this away. Men like this notice when you are not afraid. Whether that was useful or dangerous she hadn't decided yet. "We want something from him," the man said. "You are how we ask." "I don't know him," Ito-han said. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then, almost gently, "He knows you. That is enough. You already know you can't stop now. Subscribe to Midnight Soul Love and turn on notifications. Because the next episode will break your heart before it heals it." Seo Joon-ho received the call at 11:43. He was at his desk on the 42nd floor of the building that bore no name on its exterior, looking at documents that would have required explanation to anyone without the full context of the past 3 years of his life. He had a glass of water he hadn't touched. He had a silence he preferred to music. He had the particular late-night stillness of a man who has taught himself to need very little in the way of comfort, and who has spent long enough doing it that he no longer notices the absence. He read the message once. Then he set his phone face down on the desk and sat very still for exactly 4 seconds. "Find her." He said it quietly, to the room, to the 2 men stationed near the door who had been with him long enough to understand that quiet from him was not calm. It was the stillness before a system activates. The held breath before the machine starts. They were already moving before he finished the sentence. He stood and buttoned his jacket and looked out at the city below, the same city she was somewhere inside right now, frightened and alone and caught up in something she had never asked to be part of, and he allowed himself one moment of something he rarely permitted, the specific cold weight of having failed to prevent a thing he had seen approaching. He had known she was at risk for 6 weeks. He had known because he had been watching, and watching had shown him the pattern before she could see it herself. He had managed it carefully, quietly, the way he managed everything, keeping her in his peripheral vision without entering hers, removing 2 threats she would never know had been threats, positioning himself in her landscape so that if something moved toward her he would be close enough to intercept. He had miscalculated by 3 hours. The thought of it, the precise, surgical awareness of his own error, was not something he would let himself feel fully until she was back and accounted for. That was how he had survived everything that had come before. You do not let the feeling in until the work is done. You let it in after. He picked up a second phone, not the one that had received the message, and made a call that lasted 40 seconds. By the time he reached the ground floor, 12 people were already moving. The truth, when it came, arrived sideways. She had been watching the 2 men near the door for 40 minutes, cataloging their patterns. The taller one shifted his weight every 4 minutes, the shorter one checked his phone compulsively, both of them angled slightly away from her as if her presence had become routine already, when she heard the argument. It came from somewhere behind the far wall. 2 voices. Raised, then quickly lowered, then raised again. She couldn't hear the words clearly, but she could hear the shape of them, disagreement, accusation, the specific music of people who have made a plan together discovering that the plan is not going the way it was supposed to. Then a door opened in a far wall she hadn't noticed and a third man came through it, and behind him, before the door swung shut, she caught a fragment of the conversation still happening on the other side. A voice she recognized. She had heard it only once, briefly, at the Velvet Axis, but voices, like faces, have a texture that stays with you when you've been paying a certain kind of attention. And she had been paying attention that night in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself. It was one of the two men who had flanked Junho when he walked in. Not a rival. Not a stranger. Someone from inside his circle. The realization moved through her slowly, the way certain diagnoses do, not a shock, exactly, but a settling, a falling into place of pieces that had been hovering just out of arrangement. Someone close to him had done this. Someone who knew enough about his movements, his patterns, the way he had been quietly watching over her, to know exactly where she would be on a Wednesday night with a dead phone and no one waiting for her. She thought about what Jade had said. No woman leaves unchanged. She thought about the alley behind the hospital. The pale man who had nodded rapidly and walked away. What exactly had been managed that night, and for whose benefit? She thought about the coffee shop 2 doors down from the bookshop. 8 months. He had been there, a constant quiet presence at the edge of her world, for 8 months before she had ever spoken to him. She had told herself that was unsettling. She had told herself it was surveillance, obsession, the behavior of a man who arranged the world around his own desires without asking permission. And maybe it was all of those things. But the person who had put her in this room had also been watching her, and their reasons were not protection. The difference, she was beginning to understand, was not a small one. She filed this away with everything else and kept breathing and kept watching the door. She had time to think. That was the particular cruelty of this kind of fear, not constant terror but stretches of terrible clarity in which the mind, unable to act, simply processes. Turns things over. Arrives at conclusions it would rather not reach. She had been used. She understood that now with a cleanness that surprised her. Whatever Junho felt, if he felt anything, she had been a piece in a board she couldn't see. A variable in someone else's calculation. And even if his version of watching her had been gentler than this version, even if his reasons had been different, the fundamental fact remained, she had been inside his world without ever being asked if she wanted to be. She was angry. She was also, and this was the part she hated, frightened for him. Not for herself, she was frightened for herself too, clearly, she was not unreasonable, but the specific sharp worry she felt when she thought about a betrayal inside his circle, someone who knew him well enough to know exactly how to hurt him, was a different texture from the fear about her own situation. It was personal in a way she had not given herself permission to be. She had told herself for weeks she felt nothing. She had taken different routes and worked longer hours and filled every quiet space with activity so there would be no room for the thing she didn't want to name. And now she was sitting on a concrete floor with her wrists bound thinking about whether he was safe, and the gap between what she had told herself and what she actually felt had never been more apparent or more poorly timed. She heard the distant sound of movement outside the building. Then a sound she couldn't identify, sharp, structural, somewhere above her, and then the lights went out. The dark lasted 12 seconds. She counted. On the 13th second the door came off its hinges. Not dramatically, or rather, it was dramatic, but the drama was efficient, purposeful, without performance. The door simply ceased to be an obstacle. The two men who had been standing near it were dealt with in a way she didn't fully see and did not try to process, and then there was torchlight sweeping the room and voices moving in fast and organized patterns, and in the center of all of it, still as he always was in the middle of motion, was Seo Junho. He found her in the dark before the torchlight reached her. She didn't understand how. She would think about that later, the way he crossed the room directly, without searching, as if he already knew exactly where she was, and she would not be able to make it ordinary no matter how many rational explanations she tried. He crouched in front of her and looked at her face for one long moment, and whatever he was checking for he seemed to find the answer he needed, because something in his expression, that careful contained expression she had been reading and misreading for weeks, released very slightly. Not much. Just enough to see. He cut the zip tie without speaking. His hands were completely steady. She stood, and her legs held, and she said, "It was Min Jun." He went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. "The man who was with you at the Velvet Axis," she said. The one on your left. I heard his voice through the wall. I recognized it. She watched him absorb this. You already knew, she said. A beat. I suspected, he said. For 3 days. I didn't have confirmation. Now you do. Now I do. She looked at him, this man she had been trying not to look at for weeks, this impossible, infuriating, unknowable man who had apparently been quietly removing threats from her life for months without telling her, whose own trusted circle had used her as a weapon against him, whose world was full of doors she couldn't see and dangers she hadn't been given the vocabulary for, and she felt everything at once, which was too much, so she said the only thing that was actually important. You should have told me. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said simply. I should have. She had expected an argument. An explanation. The layered careful language of a man practiced at justifying the unjustifiable. The simple agreement undid something in her that had been braced for impact, and she had to look away for a moment at the far wall where the torchlight was still sweeping, where his people were moving with quiet efficiency through a scene she still couldn't fully take in. What happens now? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you go home. Tonight I will handle what needs to be handled. Tomorrow, he paused. Tomorrow, if you want the full truth of it. All of it. I will tell you. And if I don't want the full truth? Then you walk away, he said. And I will make sure nothing from my world reaches yours again. The word again landed with a weight that told her he understood exactly how much had already reached her without her knowing. That is a promise I can keep. She looked at him. The torchlight caught the side of his face and he was watching her with that complete attention, that full unguarded focus she had only glimpsed once or twice before, and she understood in this moment that whatever mask he wore in the world of the Velvet Axis and the private investment funds and the problems handled quietly, it was not on right now. This was the unguarded version. This was what was underneath. She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with any of it. She walked out of the building ahead of him into the cold night air, and the city was exactly as it had always been, indifferent, lit, moving, and she was not the same person who had walked through it 6 hours ago, and she understood that the choice he had offered her was not really between the truth and safety. It was between who she had been and who she was going to be. She stood on the pavement and breathed and did not yet know the answer. He walked her to the car, not the black windowless car, a different one, smaller, quieter, and held the door open with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and as she got in she noticed his jaw. The line of it, too tight. The particular set of a man containing something he has decided not to show. You're not coming, she said. I have something to finish. She knew what that meant. She knew what finishing it looked like in his world. She had seen the pale man in the alley nod and walk quickly away, and she had seen the held man released, and she understood that the word handled covered a range of things she had not been shown and had not asked about. She should not ask now. Jun-ho, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She hadn't planned it. It arrived the way certain true things arrive, without permission, at exactly the wrong moment. He looked at her. Be careful, she said. Something moved across his face, fast, unguarded, gone in a second. He nodded once, and stepped back, and closed the door, and she watched him through the glass as the car pulled away, standing still in the yellow light of the empty street. Getting smaller. Not looking away until she couldn't see him anymore. The car moved through the city and she sat in the back with her hands loose in her lap and the zip tie marks still red on her wrists and the night pressing against the windows, and she thought about the choice he had offered her. Walk away and be safe. Stay and know the truth. Two clean options presented by a man who managed the world in clean options, who had spent years learning to offer people exactly enough of a choice that they felt free. But she was a doctor. She had spent years learning to read what wasn't being said, to find the diagnosis underneath the symptoms, to ask the question that the patient was afraid to answer. And the question she couldn't stop asking was this: if Jun-ho had known she was at risk for 6 weeks, if he had been quietly removing threats before they could reach her, who had put her at risk in the first place? Min-jun had taken her tonight to send a message. But messages, in her clinical experience, were responses. You send a message because something has already happened that requires answering. She thought about 8 months. A coffee shop. A presence at the edge of her life that had appeared long before the night at the Velvet Axis, long before any of this. She thought about what he had said, tomorrow, if you want the full truth of it. All of it. She looked out at the city moving past. She already knew she was going to say yes. Loving him was dangerous. But walking away might be worse. Tell us in the comments, would you stay or would you run? We read every single one. Subscribe to Midnight Soul Love. Part 3 is coming. And nothing will ever be the same.